So when I was about 3 years old, my grandmother took me to a pharmacy, and she was picking up her prescriptions. And there was an older gentleman there, and he noticed me in the cart, and he came over as some elderly people do when they see a baby. And I imagine he remarked something about how handsome or cute I was. And then he asked, is he talking yet? My grandmother said, no, and it's kind of got us worried. You know, he's 3 and he isn't talking yet. And the man, out of wisdom, said, oh, honey, don't worry. He's just thinking long and hard about all the things he wants to say. And when he starts talking, he won't stop. And you'll be hard-pressed to shut him up. I imagine that if my grandmother could find that man today, he's probably passed. But if she could find him today, she would have to say, oh, how right you were. So it should come as no surprise to all of you that I wear my opinions on my sleeve. They're tattooed on my heart for most to see. And I have quite a passion for the work I do and for justice itself. And often, sometimes, my mouth, as my grandfather says, will write a check that the you-know-what can't cash. And it has gotten me into my fair share of hot water over the years, certainly. But I think that, as I was telling the children today, it's what we're called to do, to be put in hot water sometimes, to speak out of passion. And so when I was reflecting on the scriptures for today's service, the Isaiah passage, the beginning, really spoke to me in this passion. It opens by saying, shout, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet and announce to my people their rebellion. But what is this rebellion that we're announcing? Is it rebellion to God or rebellion to the laws of either man or God? Isn't preaching just announcing this rebellion loud like a trumpet, not like a muted instrument? I think that this rebellion is rebellion to injustice, and Isaiah lays that out pretty well in the following passages. He talks about fasting. Now, fasting is a religious practice that some engage in to sort of take stock of what we have and help us to know what we could not have. And for many, this is a spiritual practice that's done throughout the year. We're about to come up on a season in which some of us will fast in some way. We won't fast completely, say, from food, but we might give up something that's precious to us, like chocolate or something TV, say, those sorts of things. But Isaiah cautions against this. He doesn't say not to do it, but he says don't do it out of emptiness. Don't let these religious practices be for show, for repetition. Because practicing our faith is not simply about going through the motions, and it's not one single act ever. It's continuous, always, every day of our lives. We have to practice our faith. And rather than just fasting in this religious way, Isaiah calls us to fast in this way: to loosen the bonds of injustice, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every single yoke, to share with the hungry, to house the poor, and to clothe the naked. And Isaiah tells us that in exchange, maybe, or in appreciation from God for these good fasting practices, will be rewarded. That reward will be that our light, which is God's light magnified through us, will break forth. Isaiah promises that our needs will be satisfied, and that the Lord will guide us and water our garden like a spring. So, then the question remains, if we're called to loosen the bonds of injustices, which ones should we loosen? Because heaven knows that there are a litany of lists of injustices with which we could spend our time dedicating to these fasting practices of relieving injustice. The first one that comes to my mind this morning, and may come as no shock to some of you, is the humanitarian crisis at our border. So this past January, just a few weeks ago, I was privileged to travel to Tucson, Arizona, and to Nogales, Mexico, to a conference called Common Ground on the Border. Now, this conference is a gathering of people all denominations, all walks of life, to Tucson, Arizona, to a church called the Good Shepherd UCC. And it partners with another conference in D.C. called Common Ground on the Hill. And what these conferences are designed to do is to provide witness and truth and help to the crisis that is being faced by so many at our border. Too often we forget that the policies of our nation have serious, serious effects and real-life implications on human lives, both in our country and in others across the world. Now, this immigration crisis is not one of anyone else's making but our own. Telling the truth is the first step in correcting injustices. So we should tell the truth. That these people are fleeing a living hell. That they are not after an American dream, but to flee a nightmare. The nightmare that began long before any of us in this room were ever born. That began with our terrible policy of manifest destiny that asserted that it was our country's God-given gift to extend our nation's borders from sea to sea, not with any regard to those in between. The nightmare of ending a guest worker program that for so many was the lifeblood of both our economy and the Mexican economy. People were allowed to travel, and after they had harvested their crops in Mexico, to our farms to harvest ours and return back again freely, unobtrusively. The nightmare of the devastating economic injustice that was NAFTA, that allowed for our government to sponsor corn growers in this country to the detriment of corn growers in Mexico. The nightmare that is the recent policy of return to Mexico, implemented this past month, in which previously people who were seeking asylum, that's seeking political refuge for fear of death, were normally allowed to enter the country, be placed with a host family, and process their asylum safely. Now, upon entry, they are returned into Nogales, Mexico, for whom many that is not their home, with no possessions, no places to live. In the United States, we often say that people are coming here because they want our jobs, they want a free government handout, and that they're all criminals. But really, we create this problem in the ways I've just mentioned, but also in the fact that we support the certainty of criminal and corrupt dictatorships in Latin America over the uncertainty and freedom of new democracies that emerge in these nations. Every policy on immigration that the United States has, and coupled with the militarization of our border, are designed for one sole purpose: to detour and dehumanize migrants seeking not a life, but just life to live. In the 1 Corinthians verses that we heard this morning, we see that none of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. Friends, what else is Jesus but that migrant crossing borders? We crucify brown-skinned bodies at our border every day. Paul goes on to say, "It is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear has heard, nor the human heart conceived what God has prepared for those who love him." But I would argue that also no eyes have seen, nor ears have heard, or human heart conceived what God has prepared for those who do not love him. Well, friends, my eyes have heard, or have seen, and my ears have heard, and my heart has felt the horror, the plight, and the suffering of those neighbors at our border. As you'll see on the screen, some of you it'll be hard to make out, but technology is such, but bear with me. When you go down to the border, you see a wall, and on our side is complete desolation. 6 rows of barbed wire, no economic stimulus at all. But you go on to the Nogales side and you see life. You see beautiful artwork that ordains this oppressive image. Beautiful murals and installation pieces and chalk work. are used to silently protest this oppression. And you see a row of crosses along the border there in Nogales. And this is one of the crosses, and it really struck me that it reads, "Boy, child, 2 months old." So I'm just called to wonder, what hell must someone be fleeing that they would risk crossing such a dangerous border and fall through barbed wire on the other side? Because Jesus calls us to love God with our whole hearts and to love our neighbor as ourselves. But friends, are we loving our neighbor? On the barbed wire, you'll also see clothing torn from the bodies of people that fall over. And when I was there, I was at a shelter and I met 2 very pregnant women that had just recently been released from the hospital. And I asked them about their story, and they said that they had crossed the border wall and fallen through the barbed wire on the other side. And I tell you that my heart broke in half to hear these stories. In the Matthew text, it says, "We are the light of the world, but our border wall has cast a dark shadow on that light, dimming it for all." Like I said, wasn't Jesus any different from these migrants today? A poor brown man traveling around a desert? And when he reached this city on the hill, Jerusalem, the powers that be crucified him. That's what was waiting for him. That's what awaits so many of those fleeing our policies. Now, I know that this sounds like most of my sermons to have kind of a saddening, depressing aura around it. And I only do that to bring to your attention what's going on down there, and that I hope that you will all take time to investigate these truths and to go see it for yourself. But there is hope, however. Despite this gloom, there are disciples fighting to end this injustice. The title of this sermon is called Civil Initiative because at the border, that's what I learned we do. Most of us are familiar with civil disobedience, which is simply to protest injustices that are being committed, things we know are wrong but or that are illegal. But civil initiative is actively disobeying lawful actions. I know that sounds troubling, but one of the things that was done down there by a group called No More Deaths was to put water out in places in the Tucson desert for migrants, many of whom die from dehydration. And that is a criminal act, friends. In the state of Arizona and in so many others, that act is deemed unlawful to do. To save a human life from dehydration is unlawful. So we're called to fight these injustices, whether they're written in human law or not. And there are great people doing work down there like Artisans Beyond Borders, a group I shared with our quilting group. What this group does is they collect materials and supplies for traveling migrant folks to be able to create great and beautiful fabric works of art for quilts and all kinds of other things. I would really encourage you to look into that as well. Or Just Coffee, something this church is supporting by buying sustainable and co-opted coffee grown in Latin America to help increase the economy of those down there. But what is our part? It's contributing to these causes, to be sure, to bearing witness and telling the truths about immigration, and engaging in civil initiative. It's to let our light shine bright and not hide it under a bushel basket, to magnify God's light to all, our neighbors especially. I want to close with these 2 pieces of wisdom I found these last couple months. First from Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. Be that change. Don't just speak about it, be it. And a song by Sam Cooke that says, friends, a change is going to come. That change will arrive if we only help it along. Amen.